He retired to California, where he dedicated his presidential library along with 4 other living presidents. A firm believer in happy endings, his own last scenes were touched by sadness. In 1994, he revealed he was suffering from Alzheimer's disease. He wrote a farewell letter to the American people saying, "I now begin the journey that will take me into the sunset of my life. I know that for America, there will always be a bright dawn ahead."
For those of you who may be joining us in progress, President Ronald Reagan has died, the cheerful crusader who devoted his presidency to winning the Cold War, trying to scale back what he saw as a government far too big, and making people believe it was morning again in America. He died today after a long twilight struggle with Alzheimer's disease. A family friend said that he died peacefully this afternoon. He was 93 years old. He died at home in California. The White House was told that his health had taken a turn for the worse over the last several days. President Bush was alerted today. President Bush is in France for the commemoration of D-Day, and no doubt we'll be hearing from the president sometime as the day goes along, President Bush. 5 years after leaving office, the nation's 40th president told the world in November of 1994 that he had been diagnosed with the early stages of Alzheimer's, an incurable disease that destroys brain cells. The president said he had begun, quote, "the journey that will lead me into the sunset of my life." And today, that sunset came. We go down to Los Angeles, California, and CBS News correspondent Jerry Bowen. Jerry?
Well, Dan, reporters began their vigil at the Reagan home in Bel Air this morning as the word leaked out and finally the confirmation came that the president's health was failing and that this afternoon he had died. With him was his wife Nancy and 2 of their 3 children. He was 93, as you mentioned. He'd been suffering from Alzheimer's for nearly a decade. And because of that disease, he was denied the retirement that he had envisioned. Days spent with his close circle of friends were in the wild, wide open spaces of the ranch that he had near Santa Barbara, California. It was the West, as Mr. Reagan knew it, that helped shape his vision of America, a land where he believed the American dream was possible for anyone who worked hard enough to get it. After all, he'd come from humble beginnings to become the most powerful man on earth. And when he left that office, he headed home.
January 20th, 1989, Inauguration Day. Ronald Reagan was suddenly a former president making the long cross-country flight back to California, back to the state where he'd forged his political career.
Will there be an adjustment period for you and for Mrs. Reagan?
I haven't even thought about anything of that kind. I don't use the word retirement. I think there are a lot of things yet to be done.
You wouldn't go back to the movies. I mean, even certainly in a cameo role. I mean,
there's a kind of a lingering feeling that would look a little bit like kind of cash in on this job that I've had.
The homecoming would prove bittersweet. There was a problem that first year back, the nagging perception the Reagans were cashing in on their Washington years.
Ron and Nancy are home!
Their California retirement home, a $2.5 million hilltop ranch house in exclusive Bel Air, was a gift from 20 wealthy friends. The Reagans paid them back, but the appearance of impropriety lingered.
I've been out of work for 6 months, and maybe there's a future here.
As the former sportscaster joked about his job prospects at the 1989 All-Star Game, he was already well into a lucrative public speaking career, $50,000 per appearance. But it was a trip to Japan in October of 1989 that provoked the most stinging comments. For 2 20-minute speeches and a few public appearances, Mr. Reagan was paid $2 million by a Japanese conglomerate.
We're allies, but we're more than allies, we're friends.
Back home, Mr. Reagan could not escape a hangover from his administration, the Iran-Contra scandal. Aides were being tried for the illegal scheme to sell weapons to Iran and give the profits to Nicaraguan guerrillas. As president, he denied approving it. In a deposition for one trial, the former president had trouble remembering details.
You were not aware and did not learn of North's activities in supplying the Contras with military aid. Is that correct?
Well, I'm not sure I'm understanding this.
Years later, there was speculation this courtroom appearance revealed signs of the disease that would eventually rob him of his memory. But he continued to lead a very public life, including the 1991 dedication of his presidential library in Simi Valley, California. It was an historic occasion. For the first time, 5 U.S. presidents were brought together. And for one more time, the president revered as the great communicator shared his view of the world.
The Iron Curtain has rusted away. Totalitarianism is melting like snow.
Mr. Reagan spent as much time as he could at his ranch near Santa Barbara, hosting dignitaries he'd first met on the world stage. The ranch was still Reagan's great escape. But he could not escape what was happening to him. Slowly, perceptibly, he was undergoing a wrenching change. These were among his last public appearances. His 1994 birthday celebration. The funeral of Richard Nixon that same year. The year Mr. Reagan made a stunning admission in a handwritten letter to the American people. He'd been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. "I now begin the journey that will lead me into the sunset of my life," he wrote. "I know that for America, there will always be a bright dawn ahead."
Happy birthday, Mr. President.
As Mr. Reagan began his involuntary retreat from the public eye, his daughter Maureen became an outspoken advocate for Alzheimer's research.
But it is an equal opportunity disease, and it doesn't make special arrangements for former presidents or first ladies.
And Nancy Reagan, who had protected her husband and his image throughout their long marriage, became his voice and his ambassador.
And I'd like to propose a toast to my fella.
She went alone to his birthday celebrations and the commissioning of the USS Ronald Reagan. She mourned alone at the funeral of his daughter Maureen. The former president, remembered by millions, had become a man with no memories of his own, unable to share the major moments of his own life. Back in 1989,
I think there are a lot of things yet to be done.
On that cross-country plane trip the day he left office, the former president had mused about going home.
California isn't a place in my mind, it's a way of life.
His idea of the California dream, a dream that faded all too quickly beyond sunset into darkness.
Mr. Reagan's body will be moved to a mortuary near his home and then will be taken to the Reagan Library probably tomorrow in Simi Valley, the Hilltop Library, where the public may come to pay its respects. Then the body will be flown to Washington to lie in state in the Capitol. The funeral service will be in the National Cathedral. Mr. Reagan will make his final journey to California to be buried on that hilltop overlooking the West. Dan?
Jerry Bowen reporting from Los Angeles. Ronald Reagan, dead at age 93. Jerry, just before you go to do some more reporting, has there been an announcement about the official cause of death? We know the president was suffering from Alzheimer's disease. He'd had a bout with a colon polyp in his medical history. Any official notification about the cause of death?
There's been no official word on the exact cause of death. We do know that the nature of this disease is that eventually it shuts the body down.
Thanks, Jerry.